The trip had been planned casually, almost as if it were nothing more than a weekend escape, but to me, it carried a weight I couldn't put into words. My boss's son and I were setting out together, leaving behind the noise of the city and the rules that always seemed to bind me. I told myself it was just a hunting trip, two men heading into the wilderness for sport. But beneath the surface, I already sensed something different. He greeted me with his usual effortless charm, tossing his bag into the back of the truck as if the world belonged to him. Younger than me by a few years, he carried himself with an energy that was both restless and magnetic. There was always something in his smile that unsettled me, though I never admitted it to anyone, not even to myself. The road stretched endlessly, lined with tall trees that whispered in the wind. We rode in silence at first, but slowly, laughter and conversation began to fill the space between us. He teased me about my serious demeanor, calling me too proper for the wild. I shot back a sarcastic remark, and soon we were laughing harder than I expected. His presence had a way of softening me, of making the rules I usually clung to feel distant. When we finally arrived at the hunting grounds, the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. The world felt quieter, freer. Together we unpacked the gear, and I couldn't help but notice how naturally he moved, how he seemed to belong out here. He handed me a rifle, his fingers brushing against mine briefly. It was nothing more than an accident, yet the touch lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. The hunt began. We walked side by side through the forest, the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots marking each step. He pointed out tracks, his voice low and confident, and I found myself watching him more than the trail. At one point, he stood close behind me, adjusting my stance, his hand pressing lightly against my shoulder. His breath brushed against my neck as he whispered instructions. The closeness made me tense, though not with fear. I told myself it was the thrill of the hunt, but my heart knew better. Hours passed in a blur of pursuit and excitement. We managed to bring down a small catch, nothing impressive, yet the way he grinned and slapped my back made it feel like victory. There was something intoxicating about sharing success with him, something that went beyond sport. By evening, we set up camp near a clearing. The sky blazed with colors of fading sunlight, and the first stars began to appear. We worked together in quiet harmony, pitching the tent and gathering firewood. Once the fire crackled to life, we sat close to it, the warmth wrapping around us as the night grew colder. He cooked the meal with casual ease, tossing ingredients into a pan as if he'd done it 100 times before. I watched him under the flickering light, his face half in shadow, and realized how dangerous this was becoming. Out here, away from the eyes of others, he seemed more himself, freer, bolder, untamed, and something inside me responded to that freedom. We ate, we laughed, and the forest seemed to fade into silence around us. The fire burned low, and he leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the stars. "It feels good, doesn't it?" he said softly. "No noise, no rules. Just us." I nodded, though words failed me. Just us. The thought rang in my mind like a secret I wasn't ready to admit. As the night deepened, the chill grew sharper, and we moved into the tent. The space was small, barely enough for two. Our shoulders brushed as we settled in, and I felt a tension thick in the air. Neither of us spoke, but every breath, every shift in the silence carried unspoken meaning. I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing. We were alone, far from the boundaries that defined our everyday lives. And though nothing had happened yet, temptation had already taken root. I knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that this night would not be like any other. The trip had been planned casually, except for the distant
almost
sound of
as
the
if it were
forest,
nothing more
an
than a weekend
owl's
escape.
low call,
But to me,
the faint rustle
it
of
carried
branches.
a weight
Inside,
I couldn't put into
the
words.
air felt warmer
My
than it
boss's
should have,
son and I were
though I
setting
knew
out
it wasn't
together,
the cold keeping me
leaving
awake.
behind the noise
He
of the
lay
city
beside
and the rules
me,
that
his breathing
always seemed to
steady,
bind me.
Yet
I
I
told
could
myself
feel his
it was
nearness,
just a hunting
as if it were
trip,
pressing against
two
my
men
skin.
heading into the
I turned
wilderness for
slightly,
sport.
trying not
But
to disturb
beneath
the
the
silence.
surface,
But he
already
spoke
sensed
before I
something
could even
different.
close my eyes
He
again.
greeted me with
"You're
his
still awake,
usual
aren't you?"
effortless charm.
His voice was low,
tossing his
almost
bag
playful.
into the back of the truck.
I hesitated,
as if the world belonged to him.
Just
Hard
younger
to
than me
sleep.
by a few years.
Same here.
He carried
He
himself
said,
with an energy
shifting
that
onto
was
his
both
side to face
restless
me.
and magnetic.
Even in the dim light,
there was
I could
always
make out the
something
faint
in his
curve of a
smile
smile
that unsettled
Maybe
me.
it's this tent,
though I
too
never admitted
small
it
for
to anyone.
comfort.
Not
The
even to
comment was
myself.
light,
but
the
the
road
space between us
stretched
was
endlessly,
charged. Our
lined
shoulders
with tall
brushed
trees
when
that
he adjusted
whispered in
himself,
the wind.
and I
We
could
rode
feel
in
my
silence
pulse
at
quicken.
first.
I should
but
have
slowly
rolled over.
laughter
should
and
have
conversation
created distance.
began to fill
Instead,
the space between us.
I stayed where
He
I was,
teased
listening
me
to
about
the
my
rhythm of
serious
his breath,
demeanor,
letting
calling
it
it
pull
too
me
proper for the
closer
wild
into the moment.
I shot back
He
a
broke the
sarcastic
silence
remark.
again,
And
You
soon
know, out
we were
here,
laughing
it's
harder
different.
than I expected.
No one watching.
His presence
No one
had a way
judging.
of softening
Just
me,
us.
of making
I
the rules
swallowed
I
hard,
usually clung
hearing
to
the
feel
weight
distant.
beneath his words.
When we finally
Yeah,
arrived
I
at the
managed
hunting
to say,
grounds,
though my voice was
the air
unsteady,
smelled of pine
for a
and
moment,
fresh
neither
earth.
of us moved.
The world felt
Then,
quieter,
almost without
freer.
thinking, he reached
Together
out,
we unpacked
his fingers
the gear,
brushing lightly
and I couldn't
against my
help but
hand.
notice how
The
naturally
touch
he
was
moved,
simple,
how he
almost
seemed
innocent.
to belong out here.
Yet it
He
felt
handed
like
me
a
a
spark,
rifle,
his
igniting
fingers
something I'd
brushing
been trying to
against mine
suppress.
briefly. My
It was
instinct
nothing more than an
screamed at me
accident,
to pull away,
yet the touch
to remind
lingered
myself
in my mind far
who he
longer
was,
than it should have.
the son
The
of the
hunt
man I
began.
worked for,
We
the line I
walked
wasn't
side by
supposed to cross.
side through the
But
forest.
my body
the crunch
betrayed
of dry
me.
leaves
I didn't
beneath
pull
our boots
away.
marking
The
each
silence
step.
deepened.
He pointed out
and
tracks,
in it,
a
his
thousand
voice low
unspoken
and
truths
confident.
seemed to pass between
And
us.
I found myself
His hand
watching him more than the
lingered
trail.
on mine,
At
warm
one point,
and steady.
he stood
and
close
I felt
behind me,
myself
adjusting
drawn
my
toward
stance,
him.
his hand
You ever
pressing
feel,
lightly
he
against
whispered,
my
his
shoulder.
tone softer now,
His breath
like you're
brushed
living
against
someone
my
else's
neck
life?
as he
Like you're
whispered
stuck following
instructions.
rules that were
The
never
closeness
really
made me
yours.
tense.
I
though
didn't
not with
answer
fear.
right away.
I told
My
myself
chest
it was the
tightened
thrill
with
of the
emotions
hunt,
I had kept
but
buried
my
for
heart
years.
knew better.
Finally, I nodded.
Hours passed
more
in a
often
blur
than I
of
admit.
pursuit and
He
excitement.
smiled.
We managed to
faintly,
bring down
the kind
a small
of smile
catch,
that wasn't
nothing
about humor,
impressive,
but understanding.
Yet the way he
Then,
grinned
without
and
warning,
slapped my
he
back
leaned closer.
made it feel like victory.
Our faces
there
were
was
just
something
inches
intoxicating
apart.
about
His breath
sharing
warm
success with
against
him.
my cheek.
Something that
My
went
heart
beyond sport.
pounded so
By
loudly.
evening,
We set
I
up
was sure
camp
he
near
could
a
hear it.
clearing.
The
The
first
sky
kiss
blazed
wasn't
with
rushed.
colors of
It was
fading
tentative,
sunlight,
almost
and the
questioning.
first stars
His
began
lips
to brushed
appear.
against
We
mine
worked
gently,
together
as
in
if giving me a
quiet harmony,
chance to turn away.
pitching the tent
But I didn't,
and gathering
I couldn't.
firewood.
The moment
Once the fire
our
crackled
mouths
to life,
we sat
all
close
the
to
barriers
it,
I had
the
built
warmth
crumbled.
wrapping around
I kissed
us
him
as
back,
the night
slowly
grew
at
colder.
first.
He cooked
Then,
the meal
with a hunger
with casual
I hadn't known I
ease,
carried,
tossing
the
ingredients
world
into a pan
outside
as
the
if he'd
tent
done it 100
disappeared.
times before.
The firelight
I watched him
flickered
under the
faintly
flickering
through the
light,
fabric,
his face
casting
casting
shifting
shifting patterns
shadow,
across our
and
faces.
realized how
But
dangerous
all
this was
I
becoming.
could feel was him,
Out
his
here,
touch,
away
his
from the
warmth.
eyes of others,
The way
he
he
seemed
held
more
me as if I had
himself,
always
freer,
belonged there.
When we
Bolder,
finally broke
untamed,
apart,
and
breathless,
something
I pulled
inside
back
me responded
slightly,
to that freedom.
guilt flooding
We
my chest.
ate, we laughed,
shouldn't,
and the
I
forest
whispered,
seemed to fade
though my
into
voice
silence
betrayed the
around
weakness
us.
of my
The
resolve.
fire burned low.
Maybe not,
and
he
he
admitted
leaned
his
back
thumb
on his
brushing
elbows,
over my
gazing
knuckles.
up at the stars.
But do you really want to
It
stop?
feels good, doesn't
I
it?
searched for
He said
words,
softly,
but none came.
No noise, no
Because
rules.
the truth
Just
was,
us.
no.
I
didn't wanna
nodded,
stop.
though words failed
What
me.
followed was not
Just
rushed
us.
or careless.
The thought
it was
rang
slow,
in my
deliberate,
mind like a
filled
secret
with a
I wasn't ready to
vulnerability
admit.
I hadn't
As the
expected.
night
He
deepened,
spoke
the chill
softly about
grew
feeling
sharper,
unseen,
and we moved
about
into the tent.
craving a connection
The space
that
was
went
small,
beyond appearances
barely enough
and
for two.
expectations.
Our shoulders
I found myself
brushed as we
confessing
settled
things
in,
I had never
and
told anyone.
I felt a tension
My
thick
loneliness,
in the air, my longing
neither
for
of us
something
spoke,
real,
but every
something
breath,
untainted
every
by
shift
duty
in
or
the silence
rules.
carried
The
unspoken
intimacy
meaning.
that unfolded
I lay
between
there
us
in the darkness,
was more
my
than
mind
physical.
racing.
It was a
We were
crossing
alone,
of invisible lines,
far from
a
the
surrender
boundaries
to
that
desire
defined
and
our everyday
emotion I had
lives.
fought to deny.
And though nothing
in his
had
touch,
happened
I felt
yet,
freedom.
temptation
In his
had already
eyes, I
taken
felt
root.
recognition.
I knew,
It was
with
reckless,
certainty that frightened
dangerous,
me,
forbidden,
that this
but
night
it was
would not
also
be like
honest.
any other.
As the night deepened, exhaustion eventually pulled us both into silence. He lay close, his head resting lightly against my shoulder, his breathing calm and steady. I stared at the roof of the tent, wide awake,
ache, the weight of what had just happened pressing heavily on me. I knew, with a clarity that chilled me, that a boundary had been shattered. There would be no going back to the way things were, and though a part of me ached with guilt, another part, the part that felt alive for the first time in years, whispered that maybe I didn't want to go back at all. The first light of dawn crept into the tent, soft and cold, washing everything in pale gray. I opened my eyes slowly, still caught between sleep and memory, but the weight of the night before returned instantly. His head rested against my arm, his body pressed close to mine as if it belonged there. For a fleeting second, I let myself savor the comfort of it, the warmth, the stillness, the rare feeling of being wanted. But then reality pressed in. My chest tightened as I thought of his father, my boss, the man who trusted me, who relied on me. A pang of guilt pierced through the fragile cocoon of peace, and I carefully shifted, pulling away from him. He stirred, blinking at me with sleepy eyes and a faint grin. "Morning," he said softly, as if nothing had changed. I forced a smile. "Morning." The simplicity of his tone unsettled me. To him, it seemed so natural, so effortless. For me, it was chaos, a storm of conscience and desire colliding. I busied myself with packing, trying to hide the heaviness inside me, but he watched with an amused calm, as though he already knew my thoughts. On the way back through the forest, the silence between us felt different than before. Not awkward exactly, but heavier. Every time our shoulders brushed, I felt that spark again, and with it, the sharp reminder of what it meant. He walked ahead sometimes, laughing at small things, carefree and unburdened. I envied him. I wished I could carry what we'd done with the same lightness. By the time we reached the truck, the sun was high, painting the world gold. We loaded our gear in silence, and I caught him watching me with a knowing look. He didn't say a word, but I could see the question in his eyes. Will this matter tomorrow? The drive back was quieter than our journey there. The road stretched endlessly, the same trees passing us by, but the atmosphere was no longer filled with easy banter. Instead, it was thick with the memory of the night, pressing down on us both in different ways. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel too tightly, trying to steady myself. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're thinking too much," he said, leaning back casually. I exhaled sharply. Maybe I should be. He turned his head toward me, his expression unreadable. "Look, whatever happened, it was real. It mattered. Don't make it ugly by drowning it in guilt." His words hit harder than I expected. Real. It was real. But was that enough to make it right? When we reached the city, everything looked unchanged, as though the world had no idea what we had done. Yet I felt different, changed in a way I couldn't undo. He jumped out of the truck, slinging his bag over his shoulder, his grin as careless as ever. "I'll see you around," he said, as if this were no more complicated than a shared joke. I watched him walk away, my stomach twisting. To him, it might have been simple, a spark, a connection, a night of freedom. To me, it was far more dangerous. That night, alone in my room, the silence returned, but it was nothing like the silence of the camp. It was heavy, suffocating. I thought of my boss, of his trust, of the line I had crossed. But I also thought of the way his son had looked at me, not with judgment or expectation, but with recognition. I couldn't decide which weighed more, the guilt or the longing. Days turned into weeks, and nothing was spoken of it. At work, life continued as if nothing had happened. His son would drop by the office, sometimes flashing the same easy smile, leaning casually against the desk, but our eyes would meet and linger just a fraction too long. Each glance was a reminder, a secret tethered between us. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I would lie awake replaying the memory, the firelight, the laughter, the softness of his touch. Part of me wished I could erase it for the sake of loyalty, for the sake of peace. But another part, the deeper, hidden part, clung to it fiercely, unwilling to let it go. I knew then that I was standing at a crossroads. I could bury the memory, pretend it was a single mistake born from isolation and temptation. Or I could accept that something had been awakened in me, something that would not fade, just because I willed it to. The choice hung heavy, unresolved. But one truth remained clear. In that wilderness, under the cover of night, we had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. And whether it was a beginning or an ending, I would carry it with me always.